We're talking tonight about anthropology. The Greek word, the English word rather, comes from a Greek word, anthropos. Anthropos, it means man or human. Sometimes you'll see this translated man in the, like in the King James, but it's the idea of mankind when the word anthropos is used. There's actually a specific Greek word when you want to say man as in a male, and another word when you want to say female, but anthropos just means mankind, humanity. And so anthropology is the study of the history, the distribution, the physical development, and the cultural peculiarities of the human species, of the human race. Modern anthropology, of course, is dominated by evolutionary concepts, the idea that humans just evolved from some kind of primitive life source. But biblical anthropology is very far removed. In fact, as Brother Wayne Jackson put it in his book, The Bible and Science, biblical anthropology is light years removed from modern anthropology. In fact, you can see this little, I think they call that a word cloud, that I found online. Some of the words in the word cloud are ape. What on earth does an ape have to do with the history of mankind? Let me answer that for you. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. We might as well put insanity in this little word cloud. We might as well put stupidity in that word cloud if you're going to put words like ape and Darwin in the word cloud. It's just ridiculous, the assumptions that scientists oftentimes will start with and then work to the conclusion, the foregone conclusion that they've already had their minds made up for. So be careful of that. As I mentioned, some of this was in my mind even on the trip. I had this sermon prepared before I went on the trip. I didn't want to do science and the Bible coming back because my brains feel so scrambled after these mission trips. But I thought, you know what, I'll just put that off for a week. And then I realized, well, that's Camp in Agahey. And so many of our young people will be at camp. And this series, it's for the adults too. But it started with a question by one of our young folks. And so I thought, well, I don't want to do that when so many people are at camp. And then there was Book of the Month coming up. And first Sunday, when I usually do Science and the Bible, I was gone to Panama. So I thought, well, I'm just going to bite the bullet and get it ready before. But I had occasion to think about it quite a bit on the trip because different things that would come up, but especially one conversation that I'll mention a little bit more in just a moment. But as you can see, we've got several things to cover, so let's just dive right in and talk first of all about man's origin. Where did we come from? It's interesting, the study of anthropology and the history of our kind, our humanity, our race, being the human race, is unique. Just this study is unique to humanity. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But where do we come from? Humans are the only creatures on this earth that ask that question. You'll never see apes getting together and talking about, well, where did we come from? We're the only creatures on this planet that contemplate this even. But that's the question that sometimes comes to mind, and people often want to know, well, where did humans come from? I want to say this at the outset. How we view origins is supremely important. I can't overstate the importance of this, especially for our young people. But let's don't just say it's a young person topic, because it's not. Here's why. If we consider ourselves nothing more than, as many people have put it, and Brother Jackson referencing this concept that man is nothing more than a naked ape, then if that's how we view ourselves, then our behavior will be impacted very much accordingly. You tell people that long enough, don't be surprised when they start acting like just, a little bit above an ape. But if we believe we're made in the image of a holy, almighty God, as in Isaiah 6, you see in Isaiah 6 verse 3, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The cherubs are crying out there. Habakkuk 1:13 says he's of purer eyes and even behold evil. If you believe and understand and know that you're made in the image of a holy God and that you have a religious responsibility, a moral responsibility to him, and that you are going to stand before him one day and give an account, well, don't you think you'll be inclined to live a little bit different life knowing that? 1 Peter chapter 1, he he talks about this. In fact, he's quoting a lot here from the Old Testament, but he says, gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, think seriously, in other words. Hope to the end for the grace that is brought unto you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And then he quotes from, he says, as obedient children, not fashioning yourselves according to the former lusts in your ignorance. But as he which hath called you is holy, so be ye holy in all manner of conversation, behavior. Then he quotes from the Old Testament in Leviticus, because it is written, be ye holy, for I am holy. The idea of set apart. If we understand we're made in the image of God, it affects how we live our lives. That's just a fact. There's no getting around that. So again, it's hard to overstate the importance of this subject, how we view the origin of really all of creation, but especially mankind. That said, there are three major ideas when it comes down to human origins. Really, these are your options. It comes down to three different options. Obviously, number one is going to be the idea, this is the most popular within the world today, the idea of atheistic evolution. Atheistic evolution. This is the first idea that, again, probably the most popular, easily the most popular among much of so-called learned people today. But atheistic evolution, you know, we've talked about this before. It says all life, including humanity, evolved by strictly naturalistic processes. And of course that began with, at some point they would say, with spontaneous generation. They say, no God, there is no higher power, everything we see, everything here is all there is. That's it. And at some point it spontaneously generated life, and it evolved over a long, long period of time by strictly natural processes. I want to say about this view, it is 100% philosophical. It is not scientific. It has no scientific basis. And you know, I realize somebody's, you know, that has sat in a science class, especially if it's a collegiate level science class, you're just kind of thinking, I mean, seriously, you're going to say that's not even scientific? It's not, folks. It's philosophical, not scientific. Here's why we say that. You see, this view, it cannot explain the origin of matter. We know matter's not eternal. We know matter cannot create itself. So where did it come from? Well, it spontaneously generated. Okay, well then science demands it be subjected to the scientific method. Let's create some matter. Can't do it. You see why I say it's not even scientific, it's more philosophical. Not only that, there's no evidence whatsoever out there that life could have generated itself. Ask any scientist. You know, don't even tell them, you know, if they understand the angle, the creationist angle that you're coming from, they're going to try to weasel out of that. But you can ask any scientist just point blank. Any scientist will tell you, you say, can life spontaneously generate itself? And the answer is not even a hesitation. No. No, it cannot. That's the law of biogenesis. Not only that, this is also something that we would say is more philosophical than scientific. It's not scientific at all, because there are certain mechanisms that are necessary for developing life from a single cell. That's another conversation. We could get off on a side trail with that. But there are certain mechanisms that are absolutely necessary for life to generate from a single cell organism. And they just simply do not exist. They're not there. They're not here on this earth. You cannot find them. So how can we then, how audacious for someone, whether scientist or anyone, to say that the theory, the very flawed, pathetic theory of atheistic evolution is even scientific at all? It goes against so many known laws of science. There's no evidence. When it comes to atheistic evolution, there are only really two possible ways to explain this, as Brother Jackson puts in his book, molecules to man theory. Okay, you say life without God, without any kind of higher power, just evolved. How did that happen? We know they got to have millions of years in there, because they figure, you know, given enough time, anything's possible, which is not true in itself. But we know they got to have a lot of time. But okay, even given that time, how did it happen? Well, there are only two possibilities that they've come up with. One is genetic mutations. Genetic mutations. They say, well, you see, there can be these genetic mutations and enough mutations and you end up with a new species. Number one, that's never happened. Mutations do happen, but they've never produced a new species. I guess that probably would be, you could call that number one, you could call that number two, because equally important is the fact that genetic mutations are 99.99. I mean, literally, they've done the statistics on this. 99.99% negative. These are not Spider-Man gets bit by a spider and now he can, sling webs and he becomes a hero, or somebody gets genetic alteration and becomes the Flash. That makes for good TV shows and comic books. But it ain't real life, folks. Because in real life, mutations are bad. And quite often they're lethal, deadly. So mutations are rare and almost always negative, quite often lethal. Not only that, mutations are this regressive process. How does a regressive process explain something that is progressive? Evolution, you're supposed to be going from simple to more complex, and yet you can watch mutations, and for every 1 in a million that you get that's slightly positive, there are that other 999,999 that are negative. It's a regressive process, folks. It does not sufficiently explain a progressive theory. Never has, never will. They say, oh, well, there's another option. Oh, well, I'm about to forget. I built this into the slideshow so I would not forget it, and I still was about to forget it. I got to find this in my notes here. I've got so many different things that I wanted to mention. George Simpson, a well-known humanist, evolutionist, very, very staunch defender of evolution. I'm not sure that he's still alive at this time. I don't think he is. He's not, is he, Bob? He's been dead for some time, but very, very staunch evolutionist. Wrote a number of textbooks. In one of his books, The Major Features of Evolution, he said this, and I'm not quoting, this is kind of summarizing what he said. If you assumed an effective breeding population of 100 million individuals, just say, if we want to take it to people, 100 million people, 100 million individual creatures, and assume they could produce a new generation every day. Now, that's very optimistic. That's not going to happen. But let's just assume 100 million individuals, a new generation every single day. The likelihood of obtaining a good evolutionary result from mutations could be expected. This is an evolutionist writing this. Did I mention that? A staunch evolutionist. The likelihood of obtaining good evolutionary results, mutations, could be expected about once every 274 billion years. 100 million individuals, a new generation every single day. You can expect good results about once every 274 billion years. Scientists estimate the Earth at somewhere from 5 to 20 billion years old. You do the math. I mean, that's math even Chad can do. It's not happening, folks. There's no way, no how. And so sometimes people say, okay, well, there's another option. That option is natural selection. But you see, here's the deal with natural selection. That's not going to help, because natural selection cannot produce organisms more complex than the original. If you start out with an ape, natural selection can work all day long and over generations and generations, but it's still an ape. Can't become more complex. That's been observed time and time again. So that's not going to explain it either. So sometimes people move on to option number 2 here. This is what we often refer to as theistic evolution. Theos being the Greek word for God, so it's the idea of evolution with a little bit of Jehovah sprinkled in there. And I don't say that to be disrespectful, but that's really what it becomes. And so what happens is that there are many people who are enamored with evolution, but they acknowledge, well, it isn't really sufficient. I mean, those mutations, you're not going to get good results from that. That can't explain how we got mankind here. Natural selection sure can't explain it. Matter can't generate itself. It's not eternal. So they understand it's insufficient. But they don't go all the way with this. It's kind of like when many people sought to reform the Catholic Church. Their intentions were good, but really we didn't need a reformation. We needed a restoration to go back to the New Testament. And that's what happened later on, of course. But that's what happens with theistic evolution. They realize that evolution is insufficient, but it really becomes a compromise. And it's the idea that God started life and then guided the evolutionary process along the way. This is what came up in a discussion on the bus. And this was a lady with, she would be probably my age, maybe a little older, a sincere sister. This was not somebody who's trying to defend evolution. In fact, she even said to me, I don't believe in evolution. But this discussion came up because I mentioned the thing at the Panama Canal Museum. They said something about a tooth from a rhinoceros that was 22 million years old. And I was talking to this brother from Panama about it, and he was kind of, well, what's the problem with that? And I said, well, and from there we went into talking about the age of the earth, and I said, I'm actually going to be preaching on some of this type of stuff on Sunday night. And she kind of says, whoa, hold on, so how old do you think the earth is? And I said, well, actually, in Brother Jackson's book that I've been studying, and he's got some, I said, he's a pretty top-notch fella. He's actually got it at about 4,000 years. I said, I've heard people say anywhere from 4, maybe 6, no more than 10,000 years. Brother Jackson goes with around 4,000 years. No, I'm sorry, 6,000 total time. But I've heard anywhere from about 6 to 10,000. Well, and she says, hold on. And so we talk about this, and in this discussion, she says, well, but, why could God not have made the raw materials and then let the evolutionary process take over? I said, well, he could have, but he didn't. That's just not what he did. And he tells us. And she says, well, he doesn't tell us everything. He doesn't give us every detail in Genesis 1. I said, I understand that, but here's the thing. If you want to believe in this theistic evolution, it requires manipulating the text. Now, I try to be careful about this because, like with this sister, she's on a mission trip with us. We're out there. We're trying to win souls to the Lord. This is not somebody with an agenda to push. And sometimes when it comes to things like this, especially theistic evolution, you end up with bombs being lobbed from both sides. The evolutionist doesn't want the theistic evolutionist. I'm just going to tell you. The atheistic evolutionists, they're going to mock you. They're going to make fun of you. Oh, you want to hang on to your little myth of God, so you sprinkle in a little God, and you think you can be on our side. No. We don't want you. That's the way the atheistic evolutionists. And some of them are very, very militant about it. In fact, some of them are more militant against the theistic evolutionists than a young earth creationist. But many times the ones who are the young earth creationists, especially Christians, they're throwing bombs because they say, oh, you're trying to sprinkle in that evolution, and we don't want it. And these poor people are just getting shellacked from both sides. But at the same time, theistic evolution, if you're going to hold that position, you also need to understand it's sort of like the fellow during the Civil War that he didn't really want to fight for the North. He didn't really want to fight for the South. And so he put on gray top, blue trousers, and you know what happened? He got shot at from both sides. That's what happens with theistic evolution. And the reason is because it's a compromise. It's like you're trying to sit on the fence. And again, this was not intentional in this case that I'm talking about. But what you need to understand is you're going to have to manipulate and really work on the Bible text if you want to hold to this position. Just a couple of examples. You have to try to create a gap between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. She went there and mentioned that. And I told her, and I'll say it here, I've said it before. You read that text, there's nothing in Genesis 1:1 to 1:2 that would even remotely indicate that we ought to stop at the end of verse 1 and insert just eons of time while evolution takes place. There's nothing. It also, another manipulation that people try to do is to make the days of Genesis 1 long periods of time. This sister also mentioned that. And Wade was sitting right behind me. And so Wade mentioned, as I was going to do, Exodus 20, verse 11. God is giving the law, and part of the law is the Ten Commandments, and one of the Ten Commandments was you keep the Sabbath, the seventh day, you rest. You don't do any work. And he says, Exodus 20, verse 11, for in 6 days the Lord created the heaven, the earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Now, did the Jews work long periods of time and take one long period of time off? Or did they work 6 days? And those were 24-hour days, just like we count days 2,000, well, more like 4,000 or 5,000 years later. We know the answer to that. They worked 6 literal days. They took the seventh day off. And he's tying that in with the days of creation. There's also the argument from the Hebrew about the word yom, and when it's tied together with a numeral, it always means a literal 24-hour period of time. We talked about all that. But my point is, you begin to see that this is important. This is a view that is sometimes people view as an acceptable compromise, but it's not. It's just a compromise, and it won't fit. And here's the biggest problem with it. You've got to discredit Jesus and the apostles, who took a very, very literal approach to the book of Genesis, and particularly those first 11 chapters dealing with creation and the beginning of mankind. You got Jesus in Matthew 19:4 talking about marriage there, but he says, he which made them at the beginning made them male and female. He didn't make them apes to evolve into male and female. And he says that's at the beginning. You've also got Paul in 1 Corinthians 15:45 talking about the first man, Adam. The first man. An evolutionist would read that and say, no way. Adam wasn't the first man. They'd want to say Lucy or Cro-Magnon man or whoever it is this week that they've decided is going to be the first human being, but they're not going to say Adam. But you see, you can't believe this and hold on to the Bible. There's a lot more we could say about theistic evolution, but that's one of the things that I wanted to mention because sometimes people view that as an acceptable compromise, and it won't work, folks. And we need to understand that. And one of the things that she said is, well, I think if we're going to tell our children, we got to be honest. I mean, look at all these people out here that tell us about evolution and the age of the earth and all these things. And I said, listen, but I understand what you're saying, but we can't compromise to do that. And we've got to teach our children to reason this out and don't accept something just because somebody says it. We've also got to teach our children that sometimes people approach something like the age of the earth and the age of humanity and the origin of mankind with an agenda. Sometimes they're approaching it from an angle, and you're going to see that in some of these things that we'll talk about just with this. And then there's the third view, which is the biblical view. The biblical view is all creation occurred by divine fiat. God spoke everything into existence, ex nihilo, out of nothing, in 6 literal 24-hour days. As Brother Jackson says, this view is, quote, pure and uncluttered by ancient myth, end quote. I love that statement. It's so true. This biblical view gives no endorsement to the ever-changing evolutionary scheme. Hey, if you want to be an evolutionist and you don't like the current state of things, the current explanation, just hang around. They'll change it. It won't be long. They'll change it. They'll update it. But you know what? The Bible has said what it said for thousands of years. There's a fellow, W.F. Albright. He had this to say. This is a quote. This was in his book, The Old Testament and Archaeology. Quote, the account of creation which we find in chapter 1 of Genesis is unique in ancient literature. It undoubtedly reflects an advanced monotheistic point of view with a sequence of creative phases which is so rational that modern science cannot improve on it, given the same language and the same range of ideas in which to state its conclusions. In fact, modern scientific cosmogony shows such a disconcerting tendency to be short-lived that it may be seriously doubted whether science has yet caught up with the biblical story. That's W.F. Albright. He was a world-famous archaeologist and no conservative, folks. He's not trying to defend a conservative approach there. But you see, the biblical view has stayed the same. Science keeps changing its story. It'll move to this, it'll move to that. The Bible has said what it says now since it was written. It's not being changed. So that's man's origin. Let's talk about man's uniqueness. Are humans special? Are we just higher on the food chain? Just advanced animals? Just the highest in the animal kingdom? Or is there something special about humans? There are a lot of unique qualities that distinguish and distance man from the apes. Sometimes they want to talk about similarities. There are some similarities. There are also similarities between other creatures that no scientist would try to say one evolved from the other. And when it comes to similarities, you know, sometimes we even do this now. I learned this. I don't know beans about computer coding, writing computer code. I learned just enough about that to know I don't know much about it and don't want to fool too much with it. But I did learn that sometimes when you're writing a code for a certain thing, maybe it's you want a random sequence of numbers. Or maybe you want to take a random set of numbers and line them up in numerical value, lowest to highest. Or maybe you want to turn around and go highest to lowest. Or maybe you want to find the middle. Maybe you want to find the average. All these different things, there are codes that you would write in certain computer languages. But you know what? People do. Now, when you're in college, they make you write those things, much to our chagrin. But when you're in the real world and you're working, the boss doesn't want you to just write that code from scratch every single time. Because those codes many times are out there on the internet. Somebody said, hey, here's a code for a random number if you're doing C++. And you can grab that and you can plug it in and you got it. And you can reuse stuff. Did it ever occur to you that maybe God did that too? And maybe there's some similarities between creatures because God is using what we sometimes refer to as divine economy? But there are plenty of distinctions, folks, that make it almost laughable that anybody would say, well, humans are just a little higher up than apes. There are some physical distinctions. Here are just a few. Humans, the axis of the human head is positioned to accommodate upright walking. Not so with an ape. An ape's feet are designed for grasping. They have arms that are longer for tree swinging. Because guess what? That's what an almighty creator made them for. That's how he made them. They're very different from humans in that aspect. And there are other things we can talk about. I just wanted to add this before I move on. There's no real fossil evidence of a half-ape, half-human creature. You hear about Lucy, Australopithecus, Cro-Magnon man, whatever it might be, and people talk about this, but have you ever noticed how you'll hear a big bang about those, and boom, and they're talking about it, and this is confirmed, we've got the missing link, and then it just kind of dies down, and nobody wants to talk about it anymore. You know why? Because they figured out that ain't the missing link. Nobody wants to come out and make, it's kind of like when the newspaper puts the headline with the big scandal, but they missed it, and you know what they're going to do when you contact them and say, hey, you printed false information. Well, in the next issue, on page 22, there'll be a tiny little segment. Oh, sorry, we made a mistake in our lead story last week. That's kind of how evolutionists do many times. We have found the missing link, and then it just kind of dies down. Hey, whatever happened with that? Well, we did some further research, and it turns out that wasn't what we thought it was. Oh, really? So be careful when you hear people say, oh, this is it. We found it. Do some follow-up on that, and you'll see there's more to the story. There are also psychological differences. Humans are self-aware, can reflect upon their history. Just the study that we're doing tonight. Again, no ape is ever going to sit and contemplate, where do we come from? Are we special? Is there a God? They don't do that. Humans plan for the future. They long constantly for improvement. How can we better humanity? How can we better our planet? How can we better our economy? Different things like that. Apes don't sit around and do that. How are we going to improve this colony of trees we got here, guys? Don't do that. That's unique to humans. Humans possess a sense of the aesthetic. Have you ever seen an ape just sitting there and he's just admiring, well, man, that is a beautiful sunset? They don't do that. You ever known of an ape compose a beautiful symphony? Doesn't happen. That's unique to humans. You think there aren't psychological differences between humans and apes? Humans accumulate knowledge over the years. But today's ape is just as ignorant as one of 30 centuries back. Humans, they're accumulating knowledge. You think of technology now. I mean, we've got some members here, 90 years old, in their 80s, that could just tell stories of the technology back when you were just a child compared to now. How far we've come because we're accumulating knowledge. Apes don't do that. No other creature on this earth does that. And so man is very unique. Humans are special. They're not just higher up animals. Well, let's talk, before we get more into that, let's talk about the antiquity of man. How old is humanity? Well, evolution claims the universe is about 20 billion years old or so. They say Earth was born, as they would put it, about 5 billion years ago, supposedly again. Biological life supposedly spontaneously generated around 2 to 3 billion years ago. And then you've got man as the newcomer on planet Earth and in the universe at somewhere around 2 to 3 million years old. Humanity, supposedly. The motive here, again, is the need for time. Like, you got to have time to accommodate evolution. I think it was George Simpson whose famous saying was, time is the hero of the plot. They figure enough time, anything can happen. And I want to talk a lot here about dating methods and all that, but I just want to say this. Be careful when you're told how old something is. This is one of the questions that the sister asked on the bus. Well, but I don't understand. What about when they say something is so old? I mean, they've dated it. All dating methods, just about all, I don't know if I can say with 100% certainty all, but just about all dating methods, all the ones that you get these astronomical numbers in millions of years, they're all based on assumptions. A lot of assumptions. For example, I'll give you an example. There's a process called uranium-lead process dating. And just a few things to mention here with that. It's a dating method that uses the decay of uranium. Uranium, when it decays, eventually will become lead. So you could take a sample of uranium, how much lead is in it? And that tells you, based on the decay of how long it takes uranium to break down into lead, well, if it's 50%, you'd know it's that certain age. But there are so many assumptions, even just with that. For one, you have to assume that the sample did not contain some lead within it already. What if it did? You've got it at 50%, and you say, well, it would take 5 million years for that deposit of uranium to break down into 50% lead. 5 million years. What if a great portion of that, or even all of that 50% lead, was already there? You're assuming that it wasn't, but you don't know that. It also assumes the decay rate has always remained constant. Remember uniformitarianism? And the biggest blow to uniformitarianism would be a universal flood. That would change everything. But they assume that the decay rate's always been the same. It also assumes that there's been no contamination from outside sources, extraneous sources, during the decay process, things that might speed it up or slow it down. Each assumption is highly questionable, and it renders the whole method suspect. So my point with all that is just be careful when you're told that something is this old. Sometimes it's circular dating. Well, we know something is this old because it was found in that layer of the earth. And we know that layer of the earth is that old because that fossil was found in it. And that's just circular reasoning. But sometimes they fall back to these dating methods that are highly suspect because they're based on evolutionary assumptions. So be careful with that. The bottom line here, there's no fail-safe method to determine the age of the earth or the age of humanity. There's no fail-safe method that we can say, boom, here's the birthday of planet Earth, or here's the exact date that humanity entered the scene on this earth. There's just no method for doing that. So be careful with that. Man, having been on this earth for 1 million or more years, runs 100% counter to biblical data. And Brother Jackson goes into this a little bit more in his book, but just want to say that from the present back to Adam is about 4,000 years. Jesus back to Adam. You look at Luke 3, I've got the present there. That's where I was getting confused while I go with 4,000. Jesus back to Adam is about 4,000 years. You see the genealogy given in Luke 3. Luke is tracing it all the way back to Adam. And even with given that there are some gaps there, because there's a specific purpose behind those genealogies. And so sometimes there'll be some gaps there, and that's, again, another discussion for another time. But even when you account for that, you can't get millions of years. You can't even get 1 million years at all. I mean, no way, no how. And the bottom line is you got verses like Mark 10:6. Jesus says, from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. Jesus says man was at the beginning. That doesn't allow for 1 million years. The Bible and evolutionary philosophy are 100% irreconcilable. You just can't. You can't hold hands with one and the other. You're sitting on the fence, and you're going to get fired at from both sides. But they're irreconcilable. We need to understand it's either atheistic evolution or biblical creationism. And the evidence is all on the side of biblical creationism. There's no real scientific evidence that would counter the biblical view. Now, let's talk about man's nature. Is man just a highly developed animal or more? This goes a little bit with the special nature of man, but just want to consider something a little bit more specific on this. What is man that thou art mindful of him? That's what the psalmist asked there in Psalm 8. Atheism says man's just matter, but we understand we treat humans differently, don't we? Sometimes you see humanists that want to try to put man on par with other animals, but even those people understand humans are different because, well, for one thing, we eat cattle, but we don't eat humans. If humans are just a higher form of animal, wouldn't they be just as subject as any other animal to be eaten? That's gross, Chad. No way. Absolutely, because we understand humans are different. What about when a dog goes out and gets into it with another dog and snarls and bites him and steals his bone? Do we go and arrest him, have a trial, incarcerate him because he stole a bone? We treat humans differently. Why? Because we understand humans are different, whether we admit that outright or not. The Bible is clear about this. Man is more than just matter. Man is made in the very image of God, Genesis 1:26 tells us. And humans possess something beyond the physical. When an animal dies, they're dead. But when humans die, there's something beyond the physical. The Bible calls this the soul, or sometimes the spirit. Genesis 2, verse 7 says, God breathed into man's nostrils, the breath of life, and man became a living soul. So we've got something that survives beyond the physical. The body without the spirit is dead, James 2 tells us. But you know what it never says? The spirit without the body is dead. Because the spirit without the body will live on. But the body without the spirit is dead. And the soul is going to survive the body's death. Paul talks about this in 2 Corinthians 5, verse 1 and following. He says, we know if our earthly house of this tabernacle were dissolved, we have a building of God, an house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. And he goes on and talks about, in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed upon with that idea of being clothed upon with immortality. And it's all about how our spirit survives this life. And in fact, he goes on and says in 2 Corinthians 5:10, verse 10 of that chapter, we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. We've got to give an account. And that soul survives the death. John saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain, Revelation 6:9. He saw this panorama of heaven, and he sees these souls, people who had been martyred for the cause of Christ. But you see, their souls were very much living. Their bodies had died, but not their souls. And of course, Jesus in Matthew 10:28 says, don't fear those who kill the body, but they can't kill the soul. He says, you need to be fearing him, talking about God, who can destroy both soul and body in hell. That's who we've got to be fearful of. And it doesn't necessarily mean the trembling fear, but it's the idea of respect and reverence and being obedient to him, understanding that he is the one who is all-powerful. So that's man's nature. I want us to make sure we understand that. We're not just highly developed animals. We have a soul that will live on and on and on into eternity. That's sometimes hard to contemplate because we just assume tomorrow's going to come. But life is so uncertain. And we have a soul, and one day we're going to give an account before this almighty God for how we lived our lives on earth. Let's talk about man's purpose. It is a tragedy indeed when someone fails to realize his purpose for being on this planet. His very purpose for existence. And it's very sad. There was a what would you call this fella? A philosopher. I was looking for it on my sheet. I just went blank. A Scottish philosopher named David Hume. Long time ago. I forget what century he was in, but a long time ago. He's been dead for a long time. But he made this statement. He was a philosopher and not a believer in God. Near the end of his life, he made this statement, quote, "Where am I, or what? From what causes do I derive my existence? And to what condition shall I return? I am confounded with all these questions, and began to fancy myself in the most deplorable condition imaginable, envisioned with the deepest darkness, and utterly deprived of the use of every member and faculty. Isn't that pitiable? I mean, just to be at the end of your life and go, who am I? What am I? I feel so completely and utterly worthless and useless. But you know what, folks? That's life without God. That's it. It is a very pitiable condition. It's miserable. We understand that we are made in the very image of God and we have a soul that's going to live on. That helps us to understand our purpose. We were made to glorify God. This is Isaiah 43, verse 7. Isaiah says, it's God speaking through Isaiah. He says, even everyone that is called by my name, for I have created him, mankind, for my glory. God created us for his glory. I have formed him, yea, I have made him. Revelation 4, verse 11, the end of that verse says, for thy pleasure they are and were created. And it's not because God needs such. Acts 17:25, Paul speaking on Mars Hill, and he says that neither is worship by men's hands as though he needed anything, seeing he giveth to all life, breath, and all things. God doesn't need our adoration, our giving glory to his name, but it's because our greatest happiness is in serving God. That's what Mary said, my soul doth magnify the Lord. The whole of man is fearing and following God, Ecclesiastes 12:13. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole of man. Listen to me carefully, folks. The person who neglects to serve God, to recognize he is, and that he's a rewarder of them who diligently seek him, the person who neglects to serve God in this life has wasted his or her life. We need to understand that. When you get to the end of this life, it's not going to matter how much money you accrued. You remember, you no doubt have seen, whether in movie form or documentaries or such, the Egyptian pyramids and the great lavish riches that were stored there so they could take it into the next life, and yet thousands of years later, there they are, waiting to be discovered or robbed or whatever might happen to them. But they're not going beyond this world. You get to the end of life and you haven't served God, you've wasted your life. What a shame. And that's why Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes. That's why God inspired him to write that. To have somebody who's been there, done that, to tell you, look, riches, fame, fortune, women, all these things that might tempt us in this life, that's not where it's at. You get to the end of life and you can store up all of that stuff and you just say vanity, emptiness, worthlessness. But you fear God and keep his commandments. That's the whole of man. I mean, he says, I went through this great experiment. Solomon's saying, by inspiration, I'm telling you this so you don't have to learn the hard way as I did. What a wasted life for Solomon. And he says, listen to me. I'm telling you, a life without God is a wasted life. Then we need to talk, we can't go further without talking about man's fall and redemption. What on earth happened to man? The greatest human tragedy of all is the apostasy from God. Through willful sin, man becomes estranged from God. Over and over again this week, I talked to people, this past week, talked to people and understood, most of them understood. Sometimes we would go and read the verses like Isaiah 59, 1 and 2, the Lord's hand is not shortened that it cannot save, neither is ear heavy that it cannot hear. But your iniquities have separated between you and your God, and your sins have hid his face from you that he will not hear. Through willful sin, in other words, it's not inherited. It's not something that, is just passed on from one person to another, but it's my sin, it's your sin, separates us individually from God. And God's holy nature can't just overlook sin. He's of too pure eyes to behold sin. So what happens next in that scenario? God has two choices. He can either allow man to be forever lost, isolated from the blessings of association with him, and that's here and in the hereafter. You've heard me say it before. You think life on earth can be tough now? You just be thankful God's presence is here as much as it is. God could take away, let man just run his course and be lost forever and separated from all the blessings of association with deity, or he's going to have to provide a means of redemption. Those are the only options. You know the answer. God provided that means of redemption. But, of course, the question is, and Paul deals with this a lot in Romans, how can a holy God, the holy God, justify man and yet still be just himself. Because he's too purer eyes to behold evil, Habakkuk 1:13. So how can he just say, you're forgiven? How can he be okay in doing that? How can that not make him hypocritical or unholy in some way, shape, form, or fashion? And the answer, of course, is Jesus, the atoning sacrifice for man's sins. This is what Paul talks about in Romans 3:21 through 26, in the context of saying all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And he goes on and he talks about in that passage that we are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. And he even goes on and he talks about that the sins under the old covenant, covered by the blood of Christ. The sins under the new covenant, as long as this earth stands, are covered by the blood of Christ. But all forgiveness for all time there, he says, is tied to the blood of Christ. That's the only way God could ever be just in saying any human being is forgiven. It's because of the blood of Christ, the redemptive sacrifice that he offered. And when we submit to and obey God, we can be pardoned. Though he were a son, yet learned he obedience to the things which he suffered, and being made perfect, he became the author of eternal salvation unto all them that obey him. Hebrews 5:8 and 9. Because of that sacrifice, you and I, we can be pardoned. And so instead of having to live lost away from God and the blessings of association with deity, we can have that blessing in this life, and we can even be forever with him in his very presence, literally, for eternity. No wonder then in 2 Corinthians 9:15, Paul writes, thanks be unto God for his unspeakable gift. And then finally, let's wrap up our discussion with a discussion of man's destiny. You know, we started off with, where did I come from? Man also wants to know, where am I going? Is there anything after this life? When the body is returned to earth, then what? You don't need me to tell you that the body will return to earth. It's going to happen. We've established that as a fact. We know the body returns to the earth. So what's after that? Well, logically, beyond the grave, there's either something or there's nothing, right? I mean, that's a pretty simple statement, but that's it, right? There's either something after this life or there's nothing. You either die and that's it, or there's something beyond this life. Well, if the answer is nothing, then life is just a meaningless riddle. And we might as well say, like Mr. Hume said, and like so many others have said, what a waste of my time, this life. No wonder people would commit suicide if that's how they view life, and they think there's just nothing after this. It's just a meaningless riddle. How we live doesn't matter one bit. It's just meaningless. Say, okay, I believe there's something. Well, what is the something? It's either all good, or it's all bad, or it's conditionally one or the other. If it's all good or all bad, then once again, how we live our lives here doesn't matter. If everybody's going to heaven, and it's going to be just eternity of happiness and joy forever for everybody regardless, it doesn't matter. If everybody's going to hell, and we're all going to be lost no matter what, then how you live your life doesn't matter. But if the something is good or bad, depending upon how you live your life, how you conduct yourself, how you respond to God in this life, then you know what? It behooves you and it behooves me to think pretty seriously about this, doesn't it? I mean, how many people just go through life and don't give it a second thought? But you will die one day. I don't know if it's going to be soon or later. There's some folks here who are far older than me. You might outlive me. There are some children here. You might outlive some of the children. We hope it's not so. We want to see our children grow up, but we don't know. Don't you think it behooves us to think about these things? When all is said and done, man's destiny is going to be either with God or without him. Where am I going? Only you can answer that question based on how you respond to God. Man's the only creature on earth interested in his past, his purpose, his present, his future. Are we considering the seriousness of these matters? You know, life is short. Life on this earth, it's just a blip on the radar, as we sometimes say. But eternity Well, that's forever. Eternity is so long. We can't even fathom that. We're so tied down by time in this life. But folks, we need to understand. People used to tell me as you get older, you understand these things a little bit better. I'm 40, but I'm already beginning to see that. You do. When you're a child, you just think tomorrow and the next day and the next day, when I turn 16, when I turn 18, when I turn 21, when I do this, when I do that. You just assume it's coming. But as you get older, you realize